There we go. All right. So yes, the chapter 13, 1 to 29, looking at the reforms that Nehemiah is putting in place, as well as the prayers that he prays after each of those particular sections. So looking at the beginning of the chapter, the first 3 verses talk about Nehemiah separating. They're reading from the book of Moses. And when the people hear that no Ammonites or Moabites should ever enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet with the Israelites with bread and water, and they hired Balaam, then they hear that and they separate from all those of foreign descent. So they pull them out and they say, okay, we're not going to have any particular relationship with them, or anything to do with them at this point. So Deuteronomy 23 is where this is laid out specifically, and then Numbers 22 is where Balaam is. It's Balaam and the talking donkey, and anyway, it's a fun little story.
Yeah, when I was reading through it the first time, the Old Testament, I came to that. I don't ever remember hearing about this before.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be one of those, we got to do this in children's time, or we got to do this.
Exactly.
Youth group or whatever. You remember that time in the Bible when the donkey talked? Well, hey. Mm-hmm.
That's a wonderful trivia question, though.
Yes, it is. So they separate themselves from those of foreign descent, and what immediately comes to mind for me is Ruth, because Ruth was a Moabite, and she was obviously the daughter-in-law of Naomi, who was an Israelite, and Naomi and her husband, her husband died. She and her husband, there was a famine, and then she and her husband and the 2 boys moved to Moab, and then her husband dies, and then the 2 boys die after taking wives, Ruth and Orpah. I may have that right. And so then Naomi says, okay, I'm going to move back. And Orpah stays, and then Ruth goes. And so at the end of chapter 1 of the book of Ruth, she says, your God will be my God, and where you go, I will go. And so because she says that, she has turned her back on the Moabite gods, and has started to worship the God of Israel. And so therefore, her place in Israelite history, which they would have known as this is being read, and remembering that she's in the line, she's the great grandmother of David, obviously she's got to be part of that. And so the way that they figure that out is that she turned away. She said, I'm going to follow after you. Your God will be my God. I'll go where you go. And so therefore she doesn't fall under this, separation. And therefore David becomes a legitimate, David is still a legitimate king of Israel. So anyway, so the other complicating factor in this first few verses of chapter 13 is, when does this actually take place? Because obviously they were reading, Ezra was reading from the Torah before, and they were, they had, they signed the covenant and all that kind of stuff. So there's some time that has passed here, obviously. But then it comes up again in the reading, and so they decide to do this. But then you go to verse 4, and it's, now before this, the priest Eliashib, who was appointed over the chamber. So it's like, is this in the right order? Is it, are these different things? Do they follow in sequence? That's that's for smarter people than me to try to figure out. But you just I'll just kind of take it in stride. So that happens. They separate themselves from the foreigners, and then it comes known that Nehemiah has left and gone back to Persia for some period of time. And while he is gone, Eliashib sets up a place in the temple for Tobiah, who is an Ammonite. So it connects back to that first section. And it's like, hey, wait a minute. We just, if they follow one another, it's like, hey, wait a minute. Didn't we just do this? Or at some point in time, we said this was a bad idea. And now we've got, and it turns out that he's, he is married into the family, or somebody's married into the family somehow. And so there's that connection. Let's see. It's related. End of verse 4, he was related. Eliashib and Tobiah were related. And so he prepares the room that previously there was the grain offering and the frankincense and the vessels and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil that were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, gatekeepers, and priests. And so what's happened is Tobiah has taken up an office in this room that was normally for the instruments and vessels and offerings of worship. And so there's the sense that possibly at some level worship has either stopped or at least slowed down, because if again you go on and you in verse 10 and following, you see that the Levites and the singers had to go back to their fields. So they show up in Jerusalem ready to serve and ready to lead worship, and yet the things that they need aren't provided for them because they've been displaced. And then to add insult to injury, the offerings of the people that are supposed to go to them have been displaced and aren't getting to them. So that's why they go back to their fields, because they had to feed their families, and at least they still had their allotment from the tribes to live on, but they're not getting the additional food and income from their temple responsibilities. And so Nehemiah hears about it, or he comes back and he sees all of this, and he's very angry. Like let's see, the original phrase is can be translated as it bitterly grieved him, and so that it was so displeasing that his heart basically was broken for it. And so he has this sort of Jesus turning over the temple kind of moment, turning over the money changers tables moment. And he tosses, he removes, throws out all the household furniture. He gives orders to cleanse the chambers, bring back the vessels and the grain offering and the frankincense. And then if you skip to verse 12, you see that because of that, Judah brings back the tithe, the wine, the grain, the oil, and then he appoints trustworthy, faithful treasurers over the storehouses. So he has this temple cleansing that's going on here, that has its parallels to what Jesus does in the temple, just prior to Holy Week starting. So at least in the synoptics. In the Gospel of John, it happens at the very beginning, and then that keeps playing out over the course of the next 3 years. But so he's angry, and he's grieving for the disrespect and the defilement of the temple, because Tobiah has been allowed to be officing there. And again, he knows Deuteronomy 23. He knows that that's not supposed to be taking place. He knows that that room was supposed to have, the grain offerings and the wine and the oil and, the frankincense and the vessels for worship. He knows that all of those things were there for a reason, for the worship of God. And so that's not happening. And so he has that all squared away again. And his prayer in verse 14 is, "Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service." And so, he and each of his prayers has sort of this phrase, "Remember me," at the beginning of it. And it doesn't feel like he's trying to sort of add this to a list of, here's the great things that I've done, and count this towards me as righteousness or whatever. He's just he's lifting it up as a way of, he sees that something unholy is happening, and so he is trying to reset it back to a position of holiness happening in the temple. And so he's trying to solve the problem, and the result is that the people respond in faithfulness. They bring back the tithe of grain, wine, and oil, and these faithful treasurers then begin to administer things the way that they were supposed to be. So it sets it right again. Okay. So that's 4 to 14. Then in 15, we start talking about Sabbath and the Sabbath reforms. And basically, commerce is happening among the Jews in Jerusalem on the Sabbath. And again, that's not supposed to be happening. They're not supposed to be buying and selling on the Sabbath. That's the day that is supposed to be set aside just for the Lord. And so they're treading wine presses. There's heaps of grain being brought in. Grain is being loaded onto donkeys. They're selling of food and fish and merchandise. And so he begins to rebuke the officials or the nobles for profaning the Sabbath. And then he shuts the doors of the wall, the gates, at dark before the Sabbath. So on Friday evening, as the sun is going down, he's having the gatekeepers, shut the doors and close them and stand guard so that they don't get opened until the end of day, when the sun goes down on Saturday. That's the technical end of the Sabbath. And so when he does that, then the first couple of times merchants show up, because they're used to showing up on the Sabbath, and they spend the night outside. They wait around, but the gates aren't opening. And Nehemiah says to them basically that if you do this again, I'll run you off. And so they stop coming, and they learn. So the result is that yes, the merchants spent the night out there for a time or two, but then they stop coming on the Sabbath. But then he also puts guards in place. And he guards the gates to keep, this is verse 22. He commands the Levites that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy. And then he prays again in the second half of verse 22. he says, remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love. So again, he's not, building up his resume. He's saying, he's asking God to remember these things he's setting things right again. So there's that. And then verses 23 to 29 are mixed marriages being condemned. And again, so we go back to the same thing that we had at the outset of the chapter, and that led into the temple being needed to be cleansed, is that Jews are marrying women from outside, from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And he says, half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke the language of various peoples. So when these mixed marriages are happening, the children, Nehemiah is worried about the upcoming generation. And when the children can't speak Hebrew, or the implication there is that they can't read it as well, that then what becomes what could end up happening is that then they stop reading the Torah. They stop reading the law and the scriptures, because it's written in Hebrew. And if they can't speak it and they can't read it, then they're really only a generation or two, if this pattern continues, from Judaism sort of being wiped off and wiped out of existence. Because if a couple of generations, maybe 2 or 3 generations, don't learn the language, and it's not passed down from generation to generation, then who's going to read it? Who's going to uphold the thing, uphold the law to the people? And how do they remain distinctive? So he's the word in the NRSV is he contended with them in verse 25. He contended with them, and he cursed them, and he beat some of them, and he pulled out their hair, and he made them take an oath in the name of God to say, we're not going to give our daughters and our sons to the foreigners. And he uses Solomon as an example of, hey, this didn't work for Solomon. He was, a great and wise king, and then he got led astray by the foreign wives, and sort of, and he calls it a great evil and an act of treachery against our God. So again, it's really strong language of this very evil is kind of the way that it's phrased in the original language. But then this act of treachery, let's see, let me make sure I got the right. It's an act of unfaithfulness. It's a trespass or a transgression. There in verse 27, and it's the idea behind the word great in verse 27 is that it can be great in magnitude, extent, number, intensity, or importance. So it's just this. It's just them trying to figure out or explain just how expansive this is and why this is wrong and why this needs to stop. And he's using Solomon as the counterpoint to say, this is what happened to Solomon, and we don't want that to happen again. Let's see. So, and then verse 28, one of the sons of Jehoiada, son of the high priest Eliashib, was the son-in-law of Sanballat. Yay, Sanballat. Thought we were done with him, but no. Again, a foreign arrangement, a foreign marriage arrangement there. It says he chased him away. I chased him away from me. And then he prays again. But this time, it's not about him. It's about the people. He says, remember them, oh my God, because they have defiled the priesthood, the covenant of the priests and the Levites. So he goes from, remember me, and now remember them. And again, I don't think it's not a vindictive kind of way of praying. It's just it just seems to be a lifting up of, here's the situation, here's what they did. And not that we need to remind God to remember things, but it's just the way we talk about things sometimes.
Maybe we're reminding ourselves.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, let's see. So what's it? So then I asked the question, what's at stake in each of these particular situations? What's at stake if the temple isn't cleansed? If Tobiah is allowed to remain in there, what's at stake? And what's at stake is basically the holiness of the dwelling place of God, the temple, as well as the ongoing worship of God. If Tobiah stays there, then he will directly interfere with the worship of God because of his particular placement. But then also because of Deuteronomy 23, he's an ongoing defilement in the temple, which means that eventually God's holiness will not stay there and will move on, which would be the beginning of the end for Judaism.
Yep.
So what's at stake with the Sabbath? There's it's the behavioral. The Sabbath is one of the key behavioral differentiations between Israel and everybody else in the known world at the time. Nobody else practices this 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. They all work, all the time, whenever. But the Sabbath, again, if you go back to Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5, where the 10 Commandments are outlined, you see that in the first case, in Exodus 20, the reason for the Sabbath is because God rested on the seventh day and made it holy. The reason that's given in Deuteronomy 5 is that you were once slaves in Egypt and had no rest, and now you will have rest. The people need to remember that they're not machines. And we need to remember that too, that we're not machines. We're not meant to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, or be on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the Sabbath is ultimately an exercise in trust. You go back to the provision of manna in the wilderness. God says, on the sixth day, gather twice as much, because on the seventh day, there will be none. And that was, so again, in the whole thing, it's like for the first 5 days, you will gather what you need for that day. Don't keep it overnight, because it'll spoil and it'll grow worms, and then people keep it overnight and it's spoiled and had worms, and they're like, ugh, this is gross. And then you have to, the initial exercise in trust is that you'll have enough for what you need today, your daily bread, and then tomorrow it will be provided for you again, and you'll have your daily bread. But then on the sixth day, you'll gather twice as much, and it will last. That day, when you store it up and save it overnight, it'll stay good, and you'll eat that on the seventh day, so you don't have to go gather it. But then on the eighth day, then the cycle starts over again. And so ultimately, the Sabbath is an exercise in trust that there will be enough bread to last you through that day. You think about, when they get into the land, that the seventh day, that they will have made preparations for that day. Therefore, they can enjoy that day rather than toiling on that day and working on that day, and be able to spend time worshiping and resting in a way that they can't necessarily on a regular day, on a day other than the Sabbath. But then also extending out to the Sabbath for the land every 7 years to lay fallow, it's an exercise in trust for the harvest in that sixth year to be plentiful enough to last for the seventh and the eighth year, because it won't be until the ninth year that the new harvest comes in, or they'll start eating on that. And that's a big trust. And then the whole debts being forgiven, that's an exercise in trust that people won't abuse that. And then the year of Jubilee again, which and there's no historical or biblical evidence they ever actually did that, but that the reset every 50 years would actually is like the largest sort of exercise in trust on that. But so it starts every day and then just builds out from there. But ultimately, the Sabbath is a statement of trust in God and practicing it. So I kind of wrote down what I say, that practicing the Sabbath says, "I trust you, God." That's what practicing Sabbath says. Now, there will be folks who go, well, that's Old Testament, and that's, kind of, that's not, that may not be applicable anymore because we live in the New Testament world, and it's like, okay, fine. It doesn't negate the value in it. It doesn't negate the opportunity to trust God in it. So for what's at stake for us, again, I think is the value of turning it off. It's like these things right here, they will eat your lunch if you don't like leave them in a drawer, another room, turn them off, and just intentionally withdraw to be intentional. So anyway, that's the Sabbath. And I've preached entire message series on the Sabbath. So I could keep going on that. And then so for mixed marriages, what's at stake for them is really the faith of Israel being passed on to the next generation, and the gradual extinction of the Jews if nobody is able to speak or to read the language of the Torah. So if that passes out of usage, it becomes a dead language, and we've seen that happen in history, that languages fall out of use, and whether that was because they got assumed by or superseded by other languages, and then the people just grabbed onto the new language and learned that, and then all of a sudden nobody speaks the original language anymore. So that's what's at stake for mixed marriages. Let's see. So, okay. All right. I'll give you a chance to talk now. If you have questions here.
Thank you. First of all, I'm gonna email this to you that I'm talking from, so you can get a little bit more information than what I'm going to be bringing up.
Okay.
And then you do with whatever you want to do with it.
Okay.
First of all, something I noticed back in verses 1 and 2. Because they weren't following the covenant that they had just signed.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about how the Ammonites and the Moabites can become members of the clan if they will, in fact, do away with their gods and agree to accept Yahweh.
Right.
Very, very similar, I guess, to our belief in Christ. And that is, we choice to accept or not.
Right.
So the wording that they used here, they had to become a part of the covenant by choice. They had to choose whether they were going to reject their gods or embrace Yahweh.
Yeah.
Here again, that's on here, and then it goes down and it's talking about Abraham and how the Ammonites and Moabites had schemed against Israel. But God had made a promise, and this goes back to God's faithfulness, which we just really got through talking about not too long ago,
right?
Maybe last week, whatever. But it goes to His faithfulness. And then it's funny that you brought up what you brought up about how things. That's the way it used to be, and it's not necessarily. And you were really talking about the mixed marriages, I think, when you brought that up. Well, this author brings it up also right here in this area where they separated all the mixed multitude from Israel. Okay, never mind. That is the same thing. They could have thought of 20 reasons not to do what the word of God plainly told them to do. Instead, they simply obeyed. They might have made familiar excuses. That command was made long ago and speaks to a different time.
Uh-huh.
Things are different now. Let's not go overboard. And let's assign a committee to examine that issue.
Did a Methodist write that?
Yeah. But I thought those were perfect. I mean, you can adjust that to the Constitution or to the Word of God or most anything. You know, it's so at any rate, you'll have those. You don't have to write them down.
Okay.
Let's see. Oh, it goes into talking about even today there may be people of goodwill in churches, honorable people who have some respect for God and His Word, yet they are not part of the mixed multitude because they have not received God's covenant of salvation in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
There are people in the church, and you know that, and a lot of us do, that there's people in the church that just haven't accepted yet.
Right.
Such people are welcome, but it should be understood where they stand. He was real. Yeah, Nehemiah really got upset about Tobiah being in the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And, the courts of the temple of God were being occupied by a man, not only a pagan, but who also had a history of actively opposing God's work.
Right.
And that reflected badly on Eliashib. And it made Nehemiah question the lasting value of the spiritual revival that he had taken them through. But when it came to what he did, as far as throwing stuff out and cleansing rooms, here's a comment here. Nehemiah was much like Jesus, who later cleansed the temple from those who profaned it. Both Jesus and Nehemiah had the wisdom not to confuse love with being nice. And they both had the wisdom to know when to take bold action.
Yep.
That's a pretty good, strong comment there. And let me see here. What else we got? You were talking about the making and spending of money, and the problem with that, according to this author, is the fact that you're doing it before or instead of glorifying God. The Sabbath was set up to glorify God. If you're making and spending money and you'd rather be doing that than glorifying God, shame on you. And there is a Colossians 2:16-17 that hits upon this. And do I have, yeah. So let no one judge you in food or in drink or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. And, then I went and stole the commentary for Colossians 2:16-17 to kind of incorporate into my discussion. You may or may not want to do it. Basically, the point is clear. Days and foods as observed under the Mosaic law are not binding upon new covenant people. The shadow is past, the reality has come. Christ is here.
Right.
So not all of that is it's legalistic in this guy's terminology.
Sure. It's not binding on
Right.
believers. Christ. Yeah.
I don't know what verse this is in Nehemiah. You bring added wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. Nehemiah knew that sin was not only a personal issue. When such open sin is winked at and left uncorrected among God's people, it invites the correcting hand of God. So,
winked at.
Pardon?
Winked at. That's an interesting image. I didn't see anything.
And then last but not least, you were talking about the mixed marriages and the extinction of the Jews. And this guy says, from this strong reaction, the pulling out of the hair and the hitting them and this, we gather he considered this to be the most dangerous of their sins. Pursuing ungodly romance and getting involved in romantic relationships God had said no to.
Yeah.
And it comes back to what you were saying. If you don't get it taken care of now, there won't be a Jewish or an Israel later.
Yeah. Right.
So, okay.
Will do.
I said I'll email this to you. I've got handwritten notes you won't get, but I'll send the other to you just so you can have something else to look at.
Sure, thank you.
I know you're running out of paper to look at.
Okay. All right, very good. Cool. So yeah, that's where I'm really like I'm sort of, I don't want to preach 3 little mini sermons this week. I'd rather preach one sermon. Because it always works better that way when I preach one sermon rather than 3. Because everybody knows it when I do it.
You got 3 points to hit upon with your what's at stake. So, yeah. And maybe you do hit 2 of them lightly and hit that 3rd one about the Sabbath that you feel strongly about.
Yeah.
Give it a little bit more oomph. Oh, there was something else in here though, and that has to do with I'm not going to find it now. Basically, I think you could read it to be something like, the fact that the lack of giving was a way of forsaking the house of God.
Yeah.
That can someday be used in we sure could use your pledge.
Yep, it could.
So, all right, I'll be done.
Okay. So next week I plan on finishing up Nehemiah, those last 2 verses in chapter 13.
Yeah. You're gonna get a full sermon out of 2 verses?
Yes, because I'm going to what I'm going to do is I'm going to expand the the picture out to talk about that. I'm going to start with sort of this idea that Nehemiah's sort of saying here at the end, I cleansed them from everything foreign. I established the duties of the priests, provided for the wood of the offering, and so he's saying all those 3 things in particular, and none of them are, I built this wall.
Yeah.
But we remember him for building the wall. But what he wants to be remembered for is building the people. And so I'm going to draw from there to Christ, and how Christ, comes to, reset everything again with his life, death, and resurrection. And that's where I'm going with that last message.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So anyway, and I'll I think sort of the 3 things: I cleansed, I established, and I provided. One of the commentaries I read made the parallel between like Caesar, and he says, I came, I saw, I conquered, was his like manifest, like his epitaph kind of deal. And so Nehemiah's epitaph is, I cleansed, I established, and I provided. Seems a lot softer than, I came, I saw, I conquered.
Yeah.
And yet, it had impact across generations. So anyway.
Yeah, it's a softer way of talking about what you did, rather. Caesar's way sounded like a soldier talking. Instead of yeah. Okay.
So there you go. And I'm still working on the next few weeks, the last few weeks of August and 1st of September. So I'll get that to you when I have it.
Yeah, I understand. Okay.
So, and then my intention is to start the new series through the wilderness on the 12th of September. That may change if that's our first Sunday back in the building. That's just to be determined at this point.
Very good.
Yep. So there we go. All right. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate you. And if you hear about any arrangements or anything like that for Carol, just let me know.
Okay.
Both Elizabeth and Rose have my contact information to get
Good.
hold of me. So, so as those things develop, then we'll pass that along. So.
And by the same token, if you hear first, if you'll let me know, so I can let the class know.
Will do.
Okay. All right.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
All right. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.